Thank you all for coming. Michael, welcome to New York.
It's an honor to be on stage with a global thinker.
But have you...
Will you show me some of it?
No, because you have... We're going to get to your book in a moment,
okay.
But you wrote a book, The Undoing Project, which is about how people's minds work. It's based on the brilliant collaboration between these two fantastic psychologists, Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who are very interested in the kind of inner workings of people's thinking. And so I thought it would be really fun for us to get to ask that question of you.
It sounds fun.
It sounds fun. But before we do that even, I wanted to revisit something I did with you last time, which is when I presented my grand unified theory of Michael Lewis. Do you remember the grand unified theory? I do. And I just want to refresh your memory because, as it turns out, your latest book fits perfectly into the grand unified theory.
About the middle of, every time we do this, about the middle of your intro, I get this paralytic face. I'm now there.
I'm going to test you on the grand.
All right.
I'm testing. Okay, we're going to start. The grand unified theory is that Michael has been as successful as he has because every one of his books reflects a kind of central biblical narrative, embodies a central biblical narrative. So I want to see whether you remember, because I told you these all last time. Do you remember? So, Liar's Poker, what's the biblical narrative?
Daniel in the lion's den.
Well done. Think about it, right? It's the
I still don't know why, but I do remember you said that.
No, it's because you were the young 20-something innocent cast into the pit of these voracious Wall Street traders.
All right.
The Blind Side.
Good Samaritan.
Exactly, right? I mean, in fact, the central narrative of the story,
they pick her up off the side of the road. Absolutely.
Michael, or
I remember that.
The hero of the story is walking along the street, and the couple who adopt him see him. It's just exactly the same. Moneyball.
The Money Changers. Jesus and the Money Changers.
No.
Expelling. No.
Moneyball is David and Goliath.
Oh, that's right.
It's
sorry.
the underfunded little guy at the Oakland A's who learns to compete with the big, powerful New York Yankees.
It's so hard to be so well understood by you. I mean, I can't even compete in understanding myself,
we're not done.
Much less in global thought.
We're not done.
All right.
Big Short. Remember Big Short?
I don't remember what you did with the Big. By that time, my mind was frozen.
Big Short is the most obvious one. Let me give you a hint. A group of people take refuge against a coming flood.
Oh, it was Noah's Ark. Right, there we go. There we go.
Exactly.
Yes, now I remember.
Noah's Ark.
And Flash Boys was Jesus and the Money Changers.
Yes, my Father's house is a place of worship, and you have turned it into the counting house.
You mean try this with the Undoing Project?
Yeah.
Adam and Eve. I don't know which one is Adam and which one is Eve, but they eat the apple.
Oh wow, that's better than the one I had. I was going to say it's Jacob and Esau.
Ooh. I don't see that, though.
Oh, no, because Jacob and Esau is essentially an allegory about academic competition. What are Jacob and Esau competing over? The primacy in their father's eyes.
Yeah.
Who's the first author? That's the question they're trying to ask, right? And Jacob tricks Esau into being first author in the eyes of Isaac. Beginning of your books, there's very often either you find out about the person because you knew them in some context, or very quickly in the course of writing it, you develop some kind of relationship with there seems to be a real personal element in the choice of books. Like, I just contrast it to myself. None of my books start with a guy I know.
Yeah, and all of mine do.
All of yours do.
That I get to, it's funny. I almost feel like that what does happen is I have to feel like I want to live with these people before I think the reader might want to live with them. And so that happens first, that a relationship develops where I think, wow, I just want to see this person again. It's so interesting. And then I realize that that's something I can get across to a reader. It's a really good sign. And at the same time, none of the people I've written about, at least who've been kind of principal characters in books, have ever left my life. I'm still in touch with all of them, pretty closely, most of them. So they kind of accumulate. Be a good party.
I was going to say, in the Michael Lewis dinner party where you invited all your subjects, that's a dinner party I would like to attend.
So let me tell you how it came about. I just published Moneyball, and Moneyball was, although ostensibly about baseball, really about, I thought, a combination of Billy Beane's kind of quest to get even with baseball for screwing up his life, and the way that markets misjudge people. That you had this team that was in the position of having to find cheap baseball players in order to survive, and that meant they had to go in the market and find bargains, and that meant they had to start thinking about what makes a bargain. Like, where do you look if you're looking for players who people don't understand? And I thought that was generalizable. I thought that if the market could misvalue baseball players, they could misvalue any kind of person. I mean, who's going to be properly valued if a baseball player isn't? But I didn't really think much about why they were misvalued. And after the book came out, there was a review in the New Republic by a pair of academics, Richard Thaler, an economist who you know, who you've interviewed on the stage, I think, right? And Cass Sunstein, who's a legal scholar. And they said basically that the story was charming, but the author sort of seemed to have missed a trick. And that these biases in the mind that led to the misvaluation of baseball players by baseball scouts, by the experts in valuing baseball players, that these had been studied and kind of uncovered by these two Israeli psychologists, Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman, working together in the 70s and 80s. And I thought, oh my God, and then one night, I was out having drinks with a close friend who's a psychologist in Cal, and I mentioned it to him, and he said, my friend's name is Dacker Keltner. Dacker was Amos's TA and at Stanford, and was friends with Danny and said, Danny lives up the hill. I'm sure he'd be happy to talk to you. And so then it got strange quickly, because this was, by the time I go and see Danny, it's maybe late 2007. And around the time I went to see him, I realized that the 1 year I had taught at Cal, I taught a writing class, and maybe my favorite student was a kid named Oren Tversky, who happens to have been Amos Tversky's eldest child. And so I don't know at what point when I realized that this partnership was a story, but I had easy access to both sides of it. And it started by just kind of hanging out with Danny. And when I went up to go see him in his house, he was agonizing over what would be his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. But in the course of helping him agonize about his book, he talked about his relationship with Amos. And I was transfixed. I mean, I realized that these two guys had explored a set of ideas that were extremely important and interesting, and their work was extremely important and interesting, but they had a relationship that I thought, that I just...
Wait, did you know that you wanted to write a book about this from the beginning, or did it occur to you halfway in?
I think I probably first had the thought that maybe this is like a story that should be told, maybe a year after I met him, and that's after a bunch of walks up in the parks around Berkeley. I mean, it wasn't right away. No, it wasn't at all. And in fact, in the audience somewhere tonight is Barbara Tversky, Amos's widow, and our Barbara will remember that we spent hours and hours kind of me going through Amos's papers and me going back and forth, like whether there's actually a story here to tell or not, but or whether I could, actually it wasn't that, it was more, could I tell the story?
Michael, before you go any further, have you reflected about how insanely lucky your career as a journalist is? So what I think is my favorite of your books, aside from this one, is Blind Side, which is an extraordinary story that happens to a guy who you knew from growing up.
This is what happens when your hand is guided by God, right?
Thank you.
When you were writing,
Thank you.
When you were writing biblical allegories,
exactly.
When you're trying to when you're trying to retell the Bible so that people hear the message.
How many times? And then you come to this, and one of the world's greatest living psychologists is living up the street from you. And his partner's son is in your class?
Yeah. No,
and you go for walks in the park for a year, and then you realize, wait a minute,
how
this is a fantastic book?
And in this case, I mean, it was crazy because this book would never happen without lots and lots of luck. Because I wasn't really the person, I didn't think, to write it. I thought you were. It kept, in the back of my mind, I kept thinking, Malcolm would do this better. And because it is your kind of subject, right? My problem, the problem I had right from the beginning, was unlike with The Blind Side or Moneyball or any of the Wall Street books, where I felt I really could get my mind around the subjects. I realized I had subjects whose minds were too big for mine to get around. That that I was the B student trying to write about A students. And the Wall Street people and the sports people, some of those people were themselves A students, but they're operating in very C student-like environments. That the Wall Street, in the end, did
you just call Wall Street a C student environment?
It's a C student environment. Danny would not tell me about himself in any kind of linear way. I got bits and pieces here and there, and then he'd just remember something that was, I mean, can I give you an example of something he conveniently doesn't remember until I'm putting pen to paper. So 7 years into this, I want to know, the people who know Danny will say that if you only know him after the Nobel Prize, you can't create him before the Nobel Prize. That it really in some way changed his relationship for the world in made him a lot less gloomy. And I mean, just people, just kind of a happier guy. And I would ask him about like what it was like to receive, do you remember the call from the Nobel Prize Committee? And I got nothing. Every which way. And then one day I proposed, and he just volunteers. We're talking about, he says, I have, when I was a kid in France, when we were being chased by Nazis and hiding in barns and chicken coops and so on and so forth, he said, I developed this really, really vivid fantasy life. And it was so vivid that, I would realize that when I imagined it, it was as if it had happened to me. So by the time I'm a young man, I have to actively avoid fantasizing about things I want, because if I fantasize about them, it's as if I got them. And when I feel that way, I lose my motivation to go get them. Now, thanks for telling me this 7 years into getting to know you, because this is kind of interesting that you have, especially since you know how interested I am in your imagination, because I think this is a big part of the collaboration. And he says, so with the Nobel, he said, I never allowed myself to imagine what it would be like to get the Nobel, as if that would do something like lessen his chances to get it. And so the day of the prize, the day the prize was announced, they had asked me the year before to come and audition for them, because while they knew the work was important enough to give the Nobel Prize to, they didn't think I was worthy. That's what he's thinking. They thought maybe Amos had done most of it, and that it was Amos who deserved the prize. So I auditioned for them by giving them a talk about just something I had done all by myself. And he was given to understand that if he was going to win the prize, he was probably going to win it in that year, the following year. It was 2002. Everybody who's in line for one of these, especially it seems the Nobel Prize in Economics, is sitting by their phone the morning of the prize, and which is actually awful. But I mean, they're all these unhappy people. Whenever you see that in the paper that someone won the prize, just be sure there are 100 people who are weeping somewhere. And he's with his wife, Anne. And he says the phone doesn't ring. And Anne kind of gets up and says, oh, well, it's too bad, kind of thing. And she goes off to get some exercise. And he's sitting there alone, and now he can imagine what it's like, what would happen if he won the Nobel Prize. And he was going to do for Amos what he felt Amos never did for him, which was to give him all the credit. He was going to give a speech with Amos, and this is what he did. He gave a speech with Amos's picture behind him. He appended his eulogy to Amos to his prize acceptance speech. The Tversky's went with him to Stockholm. He created a whole scenario. in his head. And he gave me the ending of the book, because then the phone rings.